I work for the EA nowadays, but I spent 4 years working for Stroud District Council. I'm sorry, Josh, I think I was the first local authority natural flow management officer. Just to, I know it's all, we'll just correct the councillor. So I worked there for 4 years, and we managed to put in place hundreds of interventions across a catchment. There's about 250 square kilometres, and now I think it's about 21% of the area drains through leaky dams, silt traps, dry ponds, earth bunds, stuffed gullies, all sorts of things. And you might be thinking, well, it's all very well. What's this southerner doing? Well, I'm not a southerner really, but what's this southerner doing up here from Stroud? Surely it's all flat. It's a very different landscape. Those things can't work up here. It's all very steep. Well, as the Slow the Flow crowds discovered when they came down, it's actually very similar. Stroud is formed from a limestone, it's part of a limestone escarpment. It's got a lot of steep valleys, lots of woodland, big kind of mill heritage, industrial history, and it's got a very similar type of community as well. And we heard about the strong community here. Stroud's got what my daughter calls a kind of mixture of granola dads, and I think she might include me in that description. Local artisans, poets, artists, but with a big, strong kind of farming, agrarian, kind of rural hinterland. But it's also got high unemployment rates. It's on the edge of Gloucester, and you can kind of forget about all those visions of the kind of Cotswold farmers. Stroud Valley is faced west, down towards the Severn Estuary. It's a very kind of different place. And I thought, actually, just to get things going and to test your local knowledge, I'd just do a little interactive session just to demonstrate how similar these places are. So there's a little test coming up. So what I want to do is just feel free to shout out. So there'll be a few kind of pictures and facts. So Hebden or Stroud, Calderdale or Stroud? Stroud, well done, well done. That's one of the old mills in the valley bottom, and you all know that one. Hebden. Okay, a bit more tricky. Which valley had a canal built alongside its river as part of its kind of industrial heritage in 1759? Hebden or Stroud?
Stroud is about 100 years later.
Yes, councillor knows his stuff.
I also used to work on horse-drawn narrowboats.
The Stroud Water Canal was constructed, finished in 1759. I think the Rochdale Canal was about 1804 or 1806 or something.
Designed by William.
Yeah, and then the answer to the next question, very easy. Which set of valleys were founded on the back of the wool industry? Both. Absolutely. Both set of valleys were founded on the back of the wool industry. Stroud or Hebden? Sorry. Stroud. Stroud. Sorry. Oh, I know it is. Hebden. Yes, of course. Anyway, well done. You've mostly got that right. And you might be thinking, what's with the geography lesson? Well, for me, kind of natural flow management is it's almost like the kind of embodiment of physical geography. So when you go out into a place and you're looking at the topography, the landscape, the hydrology, the land use, it's like a kind of practical application of geography. And but I don't want to focus on that kind of physical geography today. I want to think about the humans involved in natural flow management. And what I want to do is to try and kind of demonstrate to you the importance of establishing a natural flow management culture, and how kind of building a culture can actually lead you to doing more natural flow management and better work than just taking a kind of traditional, dare I say, kind of environment agency, kind of technical floods management approach. And it's what we tried to do in Stroud, but I only realised it kind of in retrospect, I guess, after about 2 years. And we discovered what we were building was a sort of a culture of a way of working and a way of doing things. And it feels a bit odd kind of describing to you, because Hebden Bridge is probably developed one of the best natural flow management cultures in the country. But I thought it'd be just good to kind of go through what I think are the elements of that, and how we can build that and nurture it and develop those sorts of cultures so that we can do more and better flood management. And what we generally mean by culture, I guess, when people talk about culture, they're talking about art, all the things that we heard about, the kind of the awards, the arts, cinema, theatre. But I want to focus on someone else's view of culture. And this is a chap called Wendell Berry, and he's a poet and a writer and a farmer from the south of America, and says one of America's most powerful radical voices. And he writes about environmental stewardship and about local economies and about people kind of solving problems on their own. And he was writing in the 60s and 70s, and if you read his essays, you'll find he prophesied most of the predicament that we find ourselves currently in as a planet, as a society. But what he says about culture, sorry, I'm in the way there, Stuart, he says, humans can escape neither our dependence on nature nor our responsibility to nature, and that precisely because of that condition of dependence and responsibility, we're dependent upon and responsible for human culture. And he also goes on to say, food is both a natural and a cultural product. And if we do not know how to adapt our desires and our methods and our technology to the places we live, that is a cultural failure of the most dangerous kind. And what he's basically pointing out there, I guess, is that there's two things. One is that if you look at the kind of world map of foods, and we all kind of know instinctively that there's it's an Instagram world map of food, so they all look American. But you know what I mean. Kind of food culture has generally developed because people have adapted to what can grow, what is successful, what foods are in their different places. So it depends upon climate, latitude, rainfall, soils, geology. We know all this. These food cultures have developed throughout millennia. And but he's also saying that, and quite recently as well, that our failure to understand that dependence upon nature is a cultural failure. It's not just a scientific failure, it's actually a cultural failure. And that if we put in place farming methods and ways of managing our land now, which are actually destroying our ability to feed ourselves in the future, that is a cultural failure. And he's talking about food, but he might well as easily go on to talk about all the other things that we depend upon for nature. And we know instinctively that what we call, there's a kind of fancy term for them, ecosystem services. And it's the way that kind of science and people have parceled things up. But effectively, it's just that we know we depend upon the way we manage land, the way that we farm, for all of our other aspects of well-being and our health and our survival. And that includes flood risk. And we know there's a link between the way land is managed, what happens, and the amount of runoff and soil erosion created downstream. And we've kind of forgotten, I think, as a society, we've forgotten about that. And I think there has been a bit of a cultural failure in that we think we can kind of exist in our towns and villages, but have no regard up to what's happening on the land. And that's what's so special about natural flow management. I think it's a kind of a reconnecting of that realization that people depend entirely. You know, I mean, in a similar way to earthworms, we exist because of muck and water, and we can't escape that. And as long as we kind of fail to recognize that, that's what Wendell Berry is talking about as a cultural failure. And I think it's really exciting. It's really exciting in natural flood management in that it allows us to create a type of a culture which can re-engage with that at a local level. And sorry, just look at my notes. Okay, so yeah, what I want to do is to just spend a bit of time thinking about who might be responsible for creating these cultures and how we can kind of go about developing them and nurturing them. So, people create cultures. It's all about the people. As I said, this is not a kind of a technical exposition. You know, Stuart went through some of the stuff earlier. I won't talk about modelling or evidence or data. It's just about people. People form cultures and they own them. And you know, we heard earlier the types of people that need to be involved: local residents who've been affected by flooding directly, people who've been indirectly affected by flooding, the businesses that have been affected by flooding, the businesses indirectly affected by flooding, the councils, the councillors, this kind of whole community of people that come together and find themselves affected by flood events. And the most important thing is the kind of people in the audience. So a community of interested and involved people who may not have been affected by flooding, or you don't think you have been, but we would hazard a guess that you probably have been, even if you don't know it. But just interested people. And we're all responsible for creating this sort of, this kind of cultural response. I want to focus on a couple of those kind of key groups, really, that I think are key to developing and setting off that culture. And the first of those is the kind of the local flood groups. So just like here in Stroud, our flood events, catastrophic flooding in 2007, flooding in 2012, and virtually every year someone is flooded either by surface water or from one of the many kind of streams and springs and gullies that exist around the area. And the flood groups, quickly got together. There are 5 of them, and they realised if they acted independently, that wasn't going to be no good, because some of them live upstream, some of them live downstream, and they realised that they didn't just want to fire the water off downstream as quickly as possible to the next people and leave them to God and nature to do their best, which is in effect what the kind of drainage acts tell us we should do. So that is the approach: clean it out, send it down, let someone else deal with it. They quickly realised that wasn't going to work for them, and so they formed groups, and they didn't just focus on natural flood management. That would clearly not be the case. You know, this is a wide cross section of people, and just like Josh earlier, people kind of try to figure out all sorts of ways of dealing with this. But they discovered that this approach meant that there was something they could engage with. So they immediately felt a sense of association and empowerment. And also it was something that could happen relatively quickly. Everything else seemed to be taking years and years and years. So there's the flood action groups. And I'll point to one thing up there. When I got my job in 2014, with the district council, the flood groups were actually on the interview panel that employed me, along with an officer in the council, someone in the EA, and there was a chair of one of our local flood groups who subjected me to very rigorous questioning about my involvement in the community, what my interest was, who did I know, and all the types of things that people are interested in. There's another group of people who are really key, and this is the landowners and the farmers, and this kind of whole ecosystem of people who exist around land management, farming, the contractors, the tenant farmers, and these are the people who own the land that we need to to work with in order to reduce the flood risk downstream. And this is what's very different about natural flood management. A kind of contemporary engineered approach. You might still need to work with a landowner, but it's just one. And you can buy them out usually, because we're a big organisation. We can buy them out. We can just build our stuff. Natural flood management doesn't work like that. You need hundreds of landowners to be involved, and you can't buy them all out, and you can't pay them all off. So you need to develop different ways of doing things. And we worked with over 20 landowners in Stroud, and I have to say we didn't incentivise or compensate them once. We didn't go through the kind of agricultural payment system. I'll tell you a bit more about how I worked with them. They were paid, but they weren't compensated or incentivised. This was all about who was doing the asking, not about what we were asking them to do. And this is what I mean by kind of creating a local culture that can help you do more and better. I think one of the biggest ways that we can make natural flood management a cultural response rather than a technical response is the way that we do it. And I said do. I'm not very keen on the word delivery. Doing is the thing. And what we've got are two things there that I think are really key. As I just said, it's a catchment-wide approach. So it's the cumulative benefit of lots of small things. We're really poor, I think, as a society at recognizing the importance of lots and lots of tiny, small acts coming together to build a big effect. We like our big things that we can point at. And it's not a good, we're not used to that way of working. And I think that's part of why we don't trust it in a way, because it's lots of small things. It's not a project. If we approach natural flood management as a 2-year project, we'll fail, because you can't do anything in 2 years. You can't create the relationships. You can't create the culture. It's a form of land and watercourse management that basically we need to instill for the long term now. This is it. Climate change is going to make flood risk worse. It's not a project we can solve. We need to bring all our tools to bear, and this is a long-term game. Don't overcomplicate natural flood management. It doesn't need modelling. It needs evidence. It doesn't need all these kind of technical startup stuff that people usually bring out when they're talking about flood responses. It disenfranchises people if you walk in there with models and with technical kind of exclusive data, and it sets it up as a professional kind of approach. And there are professional and technical aspects to it, absolutely, don't get me wrong. But it's about walking and talking to landowners and forming relationships and using and respecting that local knowledge to make your work accessible. The more accessible it is, the more people will want to be involved. So accessibility is really key. There's lots of free stuff. If you need technical stuff, surface water flow maps, maps on the EA website, it's all free. It'll tell you as much as you need to know to walk onto a landowner's land and start talking about the potential there. I said I'd say a bit more about working with landowners. This really is collaborative design. If you walk onto someone's land, if someone came into my house and started telling me how to build my walls and do my gardens and manage my weeds, I'd be a little bit put out. And there's no different really when it comes to farmers and landowners. And it really is about a collaborative approach. So allow their experience and their knowledge to guide you, even if you don't actually think what they're suggesting is the right thing at first. You're better off gaining confidence and doing it, because don't forget, this isn't not a one-off project. You're forming a relationship that will allow you to do things over the long term. So you don't have to solve everything overnight, straight away. And I know people will say, well, the funding tells me I've got 3 years to do it. I think we've got to kind of set that aside and instill kind of a longer-term approach to doing things. And the way we did this in Stroud was I got permission, I got a derogation from the finance officer at the council told me I didn't have to go through getting 3 or 4 tenders. If I found a landowner who was willing to work, I was able to offer them directly the contract to do the work without going to tender at best value, on the basis they wouldn't be keen on doing it if there was no benefit. But so we contracted them, and then I supervised their works. And that built local ownership, it built pride, and it built understanding in why they were doing the work, and it linked them with people further downstream. And not forgetting, I know, this is really teaching your granny to suck eggs, because you guys have excelled in the use of volunteers. I always found volunteers a bit of a pain, just because the paperwork involved in having people around falling trees and things was always much worse than me just paying a bunch of experienced woodland contractors to do the thing. So I would say a blend. The guys on the left there, the woodland contractors, these people really are important. and the agricultural contractors, because volunteers won't be able to do all the work. They can do a lot, but you really, if we're going to do this in a sort of size and magnitude and intervention rates we need across the landscape, we're going to have to employ the people that excel at doing this sort of stuff. And we train them up. We build, you build capacity and use them for different jobs. Try and get a lot of different contractors involved. And they really enjoy it. And the thing is, they're only working for you for 1% of their time. And for 99% of their time, they're off on other people's land. And they used to come back to me, and that guy would ring me up and say, I did some natural flood management work. It was like guerrilla flood management work, and the landowner didn't even know. And the volunteers are really essential as well. And the benefit of that is part of that kind of building local pride and local skills. So I'm not trying to undermine that at all. It's, I think you need a blend of both for a successful kind of culture building. We like to work with local nature, and it really is about starting as far upstream as possible, little and often, small and many, however you want to describe it. This really isn't about getting the biggest bang every time you do a piece of work. It's about trying to get things that really do benefit wildlife and nature as well, because flood risk is increasing, our biodiversity is decreasing. So we really need to be doing things that benefit all round in our landscape and our countryside. And there's lots of different ways of doing this. This is one of the first gullies that we stuffed, as Stuart said earlier, and we haven't had as much rainfall over there since then, but yeah. And these are our kind of leaky dams amongst tree stumps, coppicing. So there are, you can get it. There's a whole other culture out there around wildlife and nature, and you can blend your skills and blend your objectives to get a better result. And create a local style. I mean, this is, you can have competitions, create local styles, try and do things and use things that are naturally available. We always try to, never bring materials on, never take materials off. If that's one of your guiding principles, you end up kind of scratching around for things, but it means you're using local materials and you're using stuff that's locally available. Makes it a damn sight cheaper too, as well as looking better. So, don't be afraid of creating a local style and using the materials that you've got to hand. Create a brand. You guys have been good at that as well. This was ours. I doodled it up in a particularly interesting housing meeting that I was in, because one of the peculiarities of the local authority where I worked was I was actually based in the housing department, because traditionally they managed the drainage officers. So I used to go along to the private sector housing meetings, and thrilling they were too. But create a brand and then use it and badge everything that you do with it. And I think I was the first person in our council to use a QR code. That got me a lot of brownie points with our IT department. Yeah, and then you can start to use that for your signage. You can start to kind of put things around in the landscape that help to build that kind of local feeling. And then this is the bit that was talked about earlier. Yeah. You can create this civic pride by involving the local authority. I was based in the local authority. The councillors loved the fact that we were circulating that money in the local economy, because we were employing local people and the money was staying within the local economy. Don't be afraid to use some of those kind of artists and artisans. Stroud's got a whole ecosystem of people like that as well, that wanted to do sculptures, wanted to do carvings, wanted to write stuff and do stuff. And it was really, it was a fantastic aspect of natural flood management, that you can actually make use of that, knowing that it's going to help you in your job. So when I used to go back to my housing manager and say, I'd like to commission a filmmaker, she was actually kind of reassured and confident that that would help me do more flood management work. It wasn't just a nice thing for me to do. And I guess the final thing that I would say is tell good stories, because natural flood management gives this fantastic opportunity to tell great stories. There's stories about empowerment of people who've been psychologically affected, who've been, their health has suffered really badly. There are great stories about money and the local economy and people helping themselves and doing stuff for themselves. There's stories about helping wildlife and working with nature. And we all know that stories are, work better. They actually are better tools and better ways of convincing people and talking about a project than facts and figures. And I want to turn to another poet who's a Stroud one this time, because he puts this much more eloquently than I. And he's a chap called Adam Horovitz, and he's based in the Slough Valley. And the Slough Valley is one of what we call our rapid response catchment. So there's about 100 properties, 60 to 100 properties at risk of destruction and flooding at the bottom end of that valley. And Adam grew up there, and this is a sort of interesting mix you can get in a place like Stroud. He became the poet in residence for a farmer network called the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. And the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association is hundreds of farmers across the country who only feed their animals grass. They might take them inside, but they don't use supplementary feeds. It's all grass-fed. And they employed him. They embedded him, an embedded poet, with 4 farms, one at Malham actually, not far from here, around the country. And he wrote an anthology, which is fantastic. I really recommend it. But anyway, he's got this kind of poem which is called 4 Options for Farmers. And the final sentence of that poem there, I think, kind of captures this thing about story. It says, "Too much fact runs off busy people like water from compacted soil. Learn how to open them to the seeds of ideas, water them with stories, and watch them grow." Thank you.